Welcome to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, hosted by Dr. Catherine B. Stevens. Early Matters features in-depth conversations with leading researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on what matters most for young children and their families to thrive.
Welcome to another episode of Early Matters. I'm Catherine Stevens, your host and the founder and CEO of the Center on Child and Family Policy. I'm really delighted today to welcome Ross Thompson, who is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of California, Davis, and internationally known for his pioneering research in attachment and emotional development in very young children. Professor Thompson is also widely recognized for his work on how developmental science can inform public policy in areas like early childhood mental health, child poverty, the prevention of child maltreatment, and early education. Today, I'm thrilled that he's here to discuss his terrific new book, The Brain Development Revolution, which tells a fascinating history of how brain science came to dominate early childhood policy debates and how it's been used over the past 25 years to shape public opinion and understanding towards specific advocacy ends. Professor Thompson, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Catherine. Thank you.
So, can you begin by just telling us a little about your professional and academic background?
Well, I'm a traditionally trained developmental psychologist. And as you'd mentioned, my focus of interest has been in early childhood psychological development, particularly in the context of children's close relationships. I cut my teeth as an attachment researcher, and within that theoretical lens, have been trying to understand what is going on in these close relationships that give children insight into the world of people, the psychological experience of interacting with others. This includes studies of early emotion understanding, the development of emotion regulation, prosocial behavior, which is the term we use to describe the development of helping, sharing, caring for others, as well as self-understanding, self-awareness. And what we have been particularly interested in is the ways in which parent-child conversation helps to shape these early elements of self-awareness and awareness of the psychological characteristics of people. My interest in brain development, however, has developed concurrently with that, in part because of the kinds of events that I describe in the book that have really thrust an understanding of the developing brain into the study of children's psychological growth. But also in the last 20 years, at the University of California, Davis, I have had a cohort of colleagues who are steeped in developmental brain science, and they've really provided lots of good catalysts to supplement the work I do on children's behavioral development.
So you draw a distinction, which I think many people don't really have in their heads, between what you were first talking about, which is early development, and then what you referred to as brain development. Can you say something about what is the difference between early development and brain development? I think for a lot of people, we see those as kind of the same thing.
Sure. And it is an important distinction in the book. So to begin with, there is a long-standing science on early behavioral development, early psychological development, studies going back more than 100 years about children's developing behavior, thinking, feeling, understanding, just a wealth of knowledge coming from that work. And then there is more recently the field of developmental neuroscience, which has much more recent origins, is a much younger science. The body of knowledge is necessarily more limited, but it, of course, is what has captured public attention, beginning in 1997 with the I Am Your Child campaign. So part of the interest that motivated the book was, how in the world is it that we have this wealth of understanding of children's psychological growth coming from these decades of behavioral research? But it was really the grainy neuroimages that came from imaging studies that really captured public attention about what is going on developmentally in young children's minds and brains. And it is the juxtaposition and integration of those that is really part of the story of the brain development revolution.
So your new book that you're referring to, called The Brain Development Revolution, as I said, tells a really fascinating history of how brain science came to dominate early childhood policy debates. and you argue not necessarily driven by, quote, the science, but in many cases by public messaging about that science and how it's been used over the past 25 years to shape public opinion and understanding. You wrote the book because, as I'm understanding it, as a developmental psychologist, you're aware of a century of research on early development. And then 25 years ago, this sort of new body of brain development sort of springs onto the scene as though that century of early development science almost didn't exist. Is that a correct way of summarizing it?
Well, it certainly overshadowed the legions of studies that gave us insight into children's developing minds. And I'm sure we'll plumb into this a little bit later, but it all occurred not through accident. It really occurred through a carefully orchestrated media campaign that took place in April 1997, organized not by developmental researchers or neuroscientists, but by media celebrities, by their communications consultants, and involving a whole wealth of communicators to convey the brain development message as it existed in those days to an interested public. And to people like me, whose work had been sort of in the shadows of public awareness, as important as we thought it was astonishing to look at the wealth of interest in the public that this generated. I mean, there were segments on the morning news programs, Good Morning America, The Today Show, for 5 days, where Katie Couric and other hosts would talk about the developing brain. There were special issues of Time and Newsweek magazine. There was a White House conference. By the end of that time, you'd have to have been living in a cave to have missed that story. And the fact that people were now talking about early childhood development was fascinating. But the fact that they were talking about it through the lens of the developing brain was daunting, because the questions they were wanting to know were not ones that the neuroscience in those days could really answer. And that's why the behavioral science became an important source of information.
So I'm eager to get to the public messaging campaign that you've just described. Before we do that, there are really three main parts of this book, each one of which is kind of a standalone, fascinating topic. And I'd like to take each of them separately. So the first is you have a wonderful overview of the current state of the neuroscience, what neuroscientists now understand about the developing brain, which I'm guessing is far beyond what it was in 1997 when this campaign was first launched. And then the second part is on your professional focus, which is the developmental psychology. And then the third part is on the what you call campaign journalism, which originated as a part of this public messaging campaign. So can you just start with talking about what we do now know about developmental neuroscience, what you describe as the core story of developing neurons, synapses, and the growth of the brain, which, as I understand it, scientists now understand starts actually early in prenatal development?
Yes, part of the story that I try to tell in this book is what is the state of the science concerning early brain development, and what insights does it give us into the nature of how children grow and learn and understand their world. And this is a story really that through the last 25 years has become very familiar in most respects. As you pointed out, we now know that the most significant period of brain development, the period when the brain grows most dramatically, is not in the first 3 years of life. It's in those 9 months of prenatal development when the brain grows most exponentially. And also, interestingly enough, when outside influences, those occurring primarily through the mother's nutritional status, her stress, and so forth, can have a significant impact on brain development. But a lot of the focus of the messaging and a lot of the focus of the research has been on postnatal brain development. And the processes are ones that are familiar, I think, to many of your listeners, the way in which there is an initial blooming of neural connections and of neurons themselves in the early months and years of life. But the important process, the important developmental story is the one that follows that, the pruning of those connections based on experience. And it is the way in which experience helps to shape which connections are retained, which of them wither and are lost through disuse, that helps to clarify why early experience can be so important in shaping the developing brain. And I go into those processes and try to explain the ways in which that blooming and pruning process gets recapitulated in different areas of the brain, governing different kinds of psychological processes. And it's a process that really occurs not just in the first 3 years of life, but through most of childhood and adolescence, culminating in many respects in a little known part of the brain development story. But this was known back when the brain development revolution began, namely adolescence, as a period of resculpting the developing brain, which some have argued is really a second critical period for the brain refashioning itself according to experience and in a sense, preparing itself for adult life. And that blooming and pruning process occurs throughout then adolescence. And indeed, in some respects, the brain continues to develop throughout adulthood. We now know that new neurons in certain areas of the brain continue to be generated in the adult years, but even more importantly is that the brain becomes resculpted continuously through adult experience. The kinds of things you and I are doing as part of our daily lives have a continuing impact in shaping how your brain is developing from my brain, Catherine. So it's a fascinating story. It's also, however, a story that captures many elements that are part of what make the brain development story so interesting to audiences. First of all, you can actually look at neuroimaging. You can see those areas light up in the brain, and it casts a measure of realism to these, what have been sort of in the past, in the field that I work in, elusive, hard to pin down elements of children's development. You're seeing actually the brain developing in those ways. And that's tremendously influential to people. And it's also the sense that by looking at the brain, we are really looking at the foundations of behavior and thinking and emotions and all kinds of development, because of course, that's where they occur. They occur in the brain. They don't occur in the spleen. And then finally, the way we talk about brain development involves mechanistic processes and terminology. We talk about the wiring of the brain. We talk about the connections. We talk about areas of the brain becoming activated. It confers a kind of a predictable, mechanistic, mechanical story to children's development that is consistent with what we know about many aspects of developmental neuroscience, but unfortunately does not translate very well into our understanding of children's behavioral development, which is much less mechanistic, which is much less deterministic. It's more probabilistic. And sometimes that can be a gulf in translation that can cause some misunderstanding of what developmental science can tell us about children's growth.
So you describe two different kinds of experience-related development in children's prenatal and earliest years: experience expectant development and experience dependent development. Can you just briefly explain what those two things are and what role they play in a child's development?
Sure. And both of them relate to the role that experience plays in shaping the developing brain. When I talk about the blooming of neural connections, I'm talking about a process that is under heavy genetic control. But even if our entire human genome was devoted to nothing more than brain development, it would be inadequate to specify the trillions of neural connections that a typical brain is enlisting. And as a consequence, the ordinary process of brain development requires certain experiences to happen that help to sculpt the brain further. These are experience expectant kinds of influences. And these are things that are ubiquitous in human experience, beginning early in life. The experience of seeing pattern light stimulation, the experience of hearing sounds, including the sounds of human language, the experience of movement in gravity, the experience of touch on the skin surfaces, things that an ordinary developing person experiences as a consequence of simply being alive, except in the most deprived and really non-human conditions. And that's why they're experience expectant. The brain expects these things are going to happen, and they're incorporated into the developing story by which brain architecture is constructed.
And just to clarify, if the things don't happen, the brain doesn't develop correctly. Is that right?
That is true. And in fact, if they don't happen within a fairly broad window of time, there may not even be the opportunity to catch up if those experiences are provided at a much later time. And I describe the kinds of accounts that have helped to give substance to that conclusion. One story in particular of a profoundly deprived and neglected little girl discovered in Los Angeles named Jeannie, who was literally for her first 12 years kept in a darkened room. And as a result of some of those experienced expectant opportunities, in particular exposure to human language, were denied her far beyond the normal window in which normal language development takes place. And as a result, her rehabilitation also provided a research opportunity to find out how much language catch-up could there be. And it turns out there was some, but not fully adequate. That's experience expectant development. Most of brain development, or much of brain development, is also shaped by another kind of experiential influence that we call experience dependent. And these have to do with the experiences that may be unique to one person and not another, or specific to certain groups of individuals but not others. They also have a profound impact on brain development, but because they vary from one person to another, the brain does not expect them to occur in the same way. Here again, language is a good example. So exposure to language is experience expectant, but the particular language you're exposed to, whether it's French or Russian or English or Hebrew, is really experience dependent. And in the second half of the first year, the brain, having been stimulated by the exposure to language, becomes resculpted in the second half of the first year to become oriented toward the particular language or languages the child is being exposed to. And by the end of the first year, the child's brain has now prepared itself for what will become the astonishing vocabulary explosion of the second and third years, when children are literally learning several new words each day, and parents have to be very careful about what they're saying in the child's presence. That particular language the child's exposed to is experience dependent. And whereas experience expected formative influences are most common in the early years, experience dependent influences occur throughout life. You and I are continuing to have our brains influenced by the experiences that may be unique to your life or to mine, but are having a continuing impact on brain development.
So, shifting to the second major part of this book, you describe what you call the exciting discoveries of developmental science that predate, as you've said, the brain development revolution associated with the brain science and continue to this day. And I loved this line: the integrated development of mind and brain helped to explain why, by the time a child is ready for kindergarten, she more closely resembles the adult she is to become than the newborn she was such a short time ago. Another thing I found really fascinating is I was aware of this sort of generally, but the degree to which, until fairly recently, the study of the development of the human mind began with middle childhood. And neither the general public nor scientists understood the tremendous development going on in babies' brains. You explained that it wasn't until the 1970s that developmental scientists began taking a closer look at the mind of a baby and have been astonished at what they're discovering. So in the book, which I encourage our audience to read, it's just an absolutely fascinating book. You give a really substantive overview of what you describe as hundreds of scientific studies on the growth of children's thinking, learning, reasoning, language, memory, and their developing feelings, social understanding, and emotion management, research that's been accumulated over decades. So for people to really understand what you're saying, they're going to have to read the book. But can you give just an overview of what you emphasize in the book?
Well, now we're turning the page to talking about behavioral development or psychological development. That is the things that are occurring in the brain, but the things that have been studied using methods and measures that do not involve developmental neuroscience. And this is, again, one of the reasons why the perspective we get on development from developmental neuroscience involving brain imaging and really technology that more resembles biomedical research than how we typically think of developmental psychology is so different from the behavioral studies that we do that involve looking at children's responses to things that we present them with or observing them in their everyday environments. But there's a story that I'm trying to tell here, essentially the second story of children's brain development through the window of children's behavioral development. And it's an equally fascinating story, but because it involves different kinds of methods, different kinds of concepts, and involves questions that have evolved over 100 years of research, it offers a somewhat different story. And one of the ways in which the story is a little bit different is that it describes the child as an active participant, indeed an active instigator of their own development. This is one of the things that initially caused developmental researchers to take another look at infancy in the 1970s, because it was when they began looking at simply what the baby was looking at, proved to be an important catalyst to how the baby was being affected by experience, that they realized there's a lot more going on here beneath this apparently haphazard, disorganized infant behavior that we've been overlooking all these years. And I think in much the same way, researchers have taken that idea and have recognized that children who are engaging in the world from very early on are shaping, in many respects, their own development by the things they pay attention to, the things they show an interest in, the things that they ask questions about, and the way they respond to the answers that they're given. That's something that's very hard to model in developmental neuroscience, but it's a big part of how we understand the growth of the mind, the growth of relationships, and the growth of emotion in childhood.
So, what are some of the major areas of human capacity that researchers used to begin focusing on in middle childhood that they are now understanding are undergoing development in very young babies?
Well, that's a really good question, Catherine, because it is true that in the 60s and 70s, indeed, in the years leading up to that, when we would be asked, so when are the really important developments taking place? Oftentimes, people looked at the beginning of primary grade school as a time when children were developing the logical reasoning abilities, the capacities for systematic inquiry, the ability to interact in a sophisticated way with teachers, that this is really when mental growth takes off. And again, part of it is that we just didn't know what to look at in much younger children. And I think that, as you point out, the story has really changed. We're seeing the foundations for these skills occurring much, much earlier. I'll offer you one simple example. Some of our classic theories of moral development always have pointed to middle childhood as the time when moral growth takes place. Piaget, Lawrence Kohlberg, and many of the other researchers saw children at younger ages as being far too egocentric, far too self-preoccupied to really be considered to be morally developing in a serious way. And it was really only when children became less egocentric, became more relationally connected, and were more susceptible to the moral tutelage coming from others that moral development takes off. I'm now witnessing and playing a little bit of a role in the sea change that is taking place now is we're realizing that no, actually, early childhood seems to be a central time for moral development, in part because we now recognize children are not nearly as egocentric as we used to think they are. They're very attuned to other people's feelings, to other people's goals and intentions. They're extremely sensitive to how one person's goals are frustrated by another person, and they actually try to make things right by tattletaling on the perpetrator or by providing additional rewards to the victim.
And is this for babies as well, Professor Thompson? Is it?
There's some initial evidence of finding similar kinds of processes occurring in infancy. So much so that Paul Bloom, who's a prominent researcher in this area, has started asking whether there may be an innate moral sense that babies are actually born with that provides an initial catalyst. Well, we've come a long way now from the idea that moral development really begins in middle childhood to the recognition that actually what's happening in middle childhood is in many respects an elaboration, a fleshing out of really important developmental processes that have been taking place much, much earlier. And here again, children's relationships also play an important role because it is their attachments, their connections to parents that is part of what helps them become attuned to other people's feelings and goals and needs and desires and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it's the case that the brain science is so fascinating in a standalone way, but as you've pointed out, is in many ways less nuanced. You've written about how what you describe as the stories of the brain and the stories of the mind are integrated, but this conversation is really underscoring for me how profoundly what you describe as the story of the mind just fills out a kind of a multicolored picture that is sort of pointed to by the story of the brain. Can you just say a little bit about that integration?
One of the points I make in the book is that stories of brain and mind point to common conclusions about the nature of children's development, as exactly they should, because of course they're studying the same developing child. So when we see children in the vocabulary explosion, we also, in our neuroimaging research, find how the brain has become wired optimally toward early vocabulary development. When we see newborns who are actively seeking new visual stimulation, we have the neuroimaging studies that tell us, well, in part, that's because the brain is just creating and refining connections in the sensory cortex at an astonishing rate. So the stories of brain and mind development are coordinated right from the get-go because they're studying the same children and the same phenomenon. But the point that I make also is that the stories of brain and mind have somewhat different perspectives on development. And that's because we talk about things in the study of behavioral development that are much harder, if not impossible, to model using the tools of neuroscience. The story that I was telling you about moral development, for example, it's really hard to think about where in the brain we would look to try to neuroimage those processes. As another example, a very influential view within the study of cognitive development is the idea that children come into the world with mental modules that bootstrap their understanding of the physical world, of numerical quantities, and of other essential elements of the world that they're learning about. But we have not found any way of neuroimaging mental modules in the developing brain. So, in a sense, this integration of the study of psychological development and the study of brain development, this integration is really a work in progress. And in most cases, they're telling us consistent stories. In some cases, where the jury is still out, we're doing the research that helps us understand those behavioral processes a little bit better. But in some cases, it's as if they're working at different levels of analysis with different sets of concepts and conceptual tools, and of course, with different methods that make me think that this integration is going to be continuing to be a work in process for quite some time.
So, to shift gears to the way that really a vast, rapidly growing, fascinating body of science research has been used, as you described it, for a public messaging campaign in service of particular policy goals. So it doesn't sound as though the issue is that there is not an enormously important body of science about early development. That's somehow not true. The issue is really who's describing that body of knowledge and towards what ends. So you start this story in 1997 with a public messaging campaign called I Am Your Child, followed by a major Pew Charitable Trust's campaign promoting pre-K. Can you just tell us that story?
Sure, because it is a lot of what motivated me to write this book. To back up just one step, we often think about the ways in which science comes into public awareness as more or less an opportunistic result of what science journalists happen to focus on in their reporting. And that's what made this 1997 campaign so unusual in the sense that it basically derived from 2 years of planning as I mentioned earlier, involving some contributions by developmental researchers, but mostly celebrities, government officials, communications agencies, and child advocates taking the major role in shaping what the campaign would be, but most importantly, what its central take home messages would be to the public. So science journalists were bypassed entirely in order to create a central, focused, consistent message across multiple media forums in order to convey it clearly and directly and convincingly to the public. And if that begins to sound a little bit like how public campaigns occur both then and now, or how a lot of media messaging occurs in our contemporary world, that was part of my interest, was in the ways in which that 1997 campaign really foreshadowed the more diverse, the more decentralized, the more non-curated media environment we have by which science communication goes on today. It all really began in what was foreshadowed by the I Am Your Child campaign. Now, with respect to public policy implications, the story of brain development and the views about what its implications are for what parents should do, but also for what policymakers should do, those two themes were linked right from the beginning. And indeed, they were linked in some of the earlier efforts to talk about brain development, such as the Starting Points report that came from the Carnegie Corporation as well. The story of brain development was linked to the need for families for support. Oftentimes, that was described in terms of enhanced childcare support to increase its quality and access, paid parental leave, and other kinds of efforts to help parents do the kinds of things that would help them support their own child's brain development. And those messages were connected throughout the campaign.
So just to take a step back, so
Sure.
what was this campaign? It was called I Am Your Child. Who did it? What was their goal? What was its reach? What were its effects?
Fine. I'm happy to tell that story. The I Am Your Child campaign really has its origins in Rob Reiner, a Hollywood producer, very successful, very influential. People of my generation may remember him as playing the role of Meathead in the All in the Family series that took place decades ago. But he was also going through a personal transition. He had just recently been divorced. He was involved in Kleinian psychotherapy. And from that was his conviction, which is consistent with Kleinian psychotherapy, that a lot of who we are is shaped by experiences in the first 3 years of life. So when the Starting Points report came out a few years earlier, which talked about brain development, really only 3 pages devoted to brain development in the context of a larger report, but that's what got media attention. Reiner picked up on this and thought, this is very interesting, and contacted both his colleagues within Hollywood, but also because of his political connections, talked to Tipper Gore, who was known at those times for her work in mental health policy. And she suggested that he pursue this. And Reiner did that in the way that you'd expect a Hollywood producer to do. He came up with a primetime ABC TV special for 1 hour to profile early brain development. He worked with his colleagues and connections to mobilize these 5 days of attention to brain development that occurred on the Today Show, on the Good Morning America show. He connected with people, with Ellen Galinsky at the Families at Work Institute, to orchestrate a coordinated set of state and local events that would take place during that same period in April. And then the coup de grace was, because he was a Democratic donor, he had an audience with Bill Clinton. And it is fortunate that at that time, Hillary Clinton had also been aware of the brain development research. And so this was a really easy sell. And at the end of their 15-minute conversation, Clinton said, well, what do you want me to do? And Reiner was prepared. He said, I want you to do a White House conference on early brain development, which is what took place in April 1997. And Reiner said, I want you to draw attention to this in your State of the Union address, which in fact Clinton did. So when do you ever see a scientific message carried forth in a White House conference, a primetime special, episodes on the morning news programs, special issues of news magazines, and state and local events? I mean, as I say in the book, you had to be living in a cave not to get this message across. And it did so, again, in a completely unconventional way, not through science journalism and not through the curated critical approach that science journalists would use, but rather through a non critical and consistent message about the importance of the first 3 years.
So, the fundamental message, the bottom line message of this campaign was the first 3 years are of the greatest importance. And therefore, what was the therefore?
Well, the message was the early years last forever. Early experiences are fundamentally important. Parent nurturance is one of the most, if not the most important element of those early experiences, and that some of these early influences have to occur during time limited windows of opportunity in order for the brain to develop properly. And so these messages then were meant to mobilize parents to provide these experiences. And of course, parents ask, what are the experiences? And there are some answers to that. And to do so with a focus on providing the child with the kinds of nurturing experiences that would create emotional security and would give the child self confidence, which were, from the point of view of the campaign, some of the most important catalysts to early brain development.
So much of what you just described is true and extremely important. And so that leads me to ask specifically about the I Am Your Child campaign. And then I want to move on to subsequent efforts, which I think had a slightly different focus. What do you see as the upsides and the downsides of the I Am Your Child campaign?
Well, there's no question that the campaign reshaped public awareness, not just of the developing brain, but the importance of the first early years. And it would be astonishing if that had not happened. But the significance of this has to be seen in light of the fact that most people in 1997 were like most developmental scientists in the late 60s and early 70s. That is, they looked at the face of a baby, they looked at what babies did, they thought to themselves, there's not much interesting going on here. We can't possibly imagine that the brain is developing in a significant way. And in those days, in fact, the brain was seen as being something that was under genetic control, and therefore early experiences were probably not all that important, at least at that stage of life. And the revolution, of course, was not just the recognition that experiences are important, that they have a fundamental role in shaping how the brain develops. And those can be both positive and negative experiences. So, this is where our current awareness of stress and ACEs and their influence on brain development has some of its origins. But it was also a dawning awareness that developmental scientists now had acquired, but that was still not yet apparent to public understanding, that this little child in front of you who seems to be so disorganized and emotional and erratic and unpredictable and et cetera, is actually a thinking, feeling, reasoning being who's trying to make sense out of their world. And what is going on there is a product of a rapidly expanding brain, but also the experiences that you are providing as you are responding to that child and interacting with them. And so it got parents increasingly asking themselves as they're interacting with that baby, what are you thinking? What are you wanting? Why are you responding that way? And in a sense, to begin practicing what researchers now call mind mindedness, that is, trying to get into the mind of a baby, which, as I argue in the book, is one of the ways in which parental sensitivity is enhanced. Because it's when you start asking what's going on in your mind and in your heart and within you that a parent becomes attuned to the experience of the baby and therefore can respond appropriately to that experience.
hmm So it sounds like, in and of itself, the I Am Your Child campaign actually communicated really important and valuable new information to the public, and that maybe the most obvious downsides came from the way in which that campaign laid the groundwork for using the brain science in kind of an increasingly policy specific way. Is that right?
I think that's partially right. I certainly would not disagree that there was a quick and immediate mobilization of the brain development message by advocates to promote a range of programs that had long been advocated by early childhood advocates. And I mentioned some of them. We increased quality and affordability to childcare, paid parental leave, home visitation, and so forth. This has been part of the agenda for a long time. And I think child advocates saw the brain development story as being fully consistent with the effort to promote these on the public agenda. And as a result, this is one of the reasons why the messaging about early brain development and the science behind it was immediately linked to a set of public policy recommendations that were seen as being the natural byproduct of what the developmental neuroscience had to say. Now, I would say before overlooking it, that there were other missed opportunities from the I Am Your Child campaign that I emphasize in the book. We've touched on one of them, which is that even in those days, researchers recognized that the prenatal period is really the period in which the most significant advances occur in brain development and in which the brain is, in some respects, at its most vulnerable, which compels attention to the quality of prenatal care that women are receiving and the kind of support that their partners are providing for them. That was entirely overlooked because, of course, Kleinian therapy that Reiner was being influenced by had really nothing to say. Well, not as much to say about prenatal development as the first 3 years. Likewise, the I Am Your Child campaign completely ignored adolescence. And the fact that even in those days, researchers were aware of the significant changes in the brain that occur in the teenage years, no mention of it, again, because of Reiner's interest in the first 3 years of life. That interest in the first 3 years, by the way, was controversial to the developmental scientists advising him. They recognized that the scientific story does not fit so narrowly within the first 3 years. But, Reiner was a good marketer. He knew what a good message was. And the message was focus on the first 3 years, and that'll get parents' attention. Perhaps most significantly, I take the I Am Your Child campaign to task for completely overlooking the effects of poverty and other forms of early adversity on brain development. We had a lot of knowledge in those days about the ways in which brains can be impaired in their development by the varieties of stresses associated with poverty. And the fact that this campaign could have been a powerful tool for saying, if brain development is so important, we can't allow the kind of child poverty rate that we have in this country to continue. But that was a missed opportunity. And I suggest that one of the reasons is that the theme of the campaign, I Am Your Child, did not leave much room for talking about other people's children. And it was this othering of poverty and children in poverty that I think is most unfortunate and perhaps one of the greatest missed opportunities.
So, can you now talk about the Pew Pre-K campaign, which I think followed this and was in and of itself very influential? Can you describe the history of that, what it was and what it was trying to accomplish and what you think it did?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's worth pointing out that the Pew campaign was one of several public policy initiatives arising, I think, fairly directly from the brain development revolution that illustrate how really significantly public policy was being affected by this scientific message. The campaign by the Pew Charitable Trust emerged at the end of what had been a previous multi-year campaign to improve the quality of primary grade education. And as the board was taking stock of where they had come and where they needed to go, they recognized that where that campaign had been limited was in its neglect of the earlier years, the years leading up to the primary grades, which in fact many researchers have been aware of or becoming aware of through similar kinds of efforts. And they looked carefully at the power that the brain development message had in galvanizing the attention of the public. And also that there was growing concern about educational preparation, and decided to create a 10-year campaign, which was generously funded, to bring the message of the importance of pre-kindergarten education to the public as a remedy for the need to develop school readiness. There are some who have looked at this campaign and argue that public wasn't concerned about school readiness until the Pew campaign made them aware of it, made them concerned about it. And suddenly you got the creation of a problem, children aren't school ready, and a remedy, well, pre-K education. And it turns out there was a reality to that. Kids, in fact, including in my state in California, are often not ready for school. But the attention to that, the public awareness of that really was generated by the Pew campaign. So a 10-year campaign. And in contrast to I Am Your Child, which was a national campaign, the Pew pre-K campaign was really focused on the states, in part to build upon what initiatives had already existed. Several states already had pre-K programs that they were funding, and the opportunities and advocacy resources that already existed there. By the end of the campaign, I document some of the real successes of that effort and the fact that in addition to the numbers of states that engaged in publicly funded pre-K programs, in part as a result of the campaign, there was a more general awareness that pre-kindergarten education is a desirable, if not necessary, component of the preschool years, in part to get kids ready for school. One of the things that I point out, however, is the strange irony that with all the focus on kids in that 3 to 5 year age range, with pre-K as the lens, the childcare story got completely sidelined, even though these were the same kids with the same developmental needs and still facing the same concerns about school readiness. Nevertheless, what's very clear is that the Pew Foundation deliberately separated pre-K from childcare because they did not want to get into the political issues that were already dogging childcare from their pre-K campaign, and they succeeded.
One of my thoughts on this is just over the last handful of years, I have seen a much intensifying focus on childcare alongside pre-K. And my observation about this is that one of the things that I guess the Pew campaign played a role in this, and then ongoing advocacy, is a conflation of early development with early school. That in our society, schooling has really come to be seen as the human development path for children. And that even now, as you've pointed out, that there's this story of how pre-K1 and childcare lost. And I am seeing some indications that at this point, it may be that early school is winning and early development is losing. And I find actually what you've described as the focus of the I Am Your Child campaign, which at this point I would kind of welcome. I don't remember that campaign because, interestingly enough, at the time I was working in K-12 education and completely ignoring early childhood, which is not uncommon. I myself was entirely focused on K-12 schooling as the developmental pathway, the system for developing kids. But the idea of a national campaign focused on early development rather than early school, meaning early non-parental group institutional environments, at this point would seem almost radical. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you have centered on something that is really interesting about the Pew campaign, which is their recognition that by this point in time, parents weren't necessarily objecting, especially where 4-year-olds were concerned, to out-of-home care experiences, especially if they were educational in nature. That was a real sea change, I think, in public perceptions. And I think the brain development story helped to bring that forth. Now, where younger children were concerned, it was still a very mixed bag. But 4-year-olds going to a school or some kind of a pre-K environment, that was okay in public perceptions. I think the childcare versus pre-K divide, I see just a little bit differently in that childcare has often been presented in public policy context as a means of supporting adult workforce participation. And so, where we think about what is important about childcare, we think about the environment being safe. We think about the environment providing adequate nutrition, but we think about it primarily in the context of a place to park kids while their parents are working. And I think that is one of the ways in which the orientation by childcare advocates is so very different from the one that made pre-K a successful public advocacy campaign, because you couldn't capitalize on the brain development agenda and the focus on promoting early development if you were primarily concerned about settings where children could be essentially warehoused while their parents are working. And the fact that it wasn't just the marginalization of some of the major organizations promoting childcare and its quality, like the National Association for the Education of Young Children, they were completely marginalized from the Pew campaign, but they also did not do much at that time to try to reconceptualize childcare. So even just a few years ago, when I was testifying before the California legislature, along with several others, about reforming the state-funded childcare system, I was hearing some advocates talking about creating more childcare slots so more parents can work. And I was one of the few voices talking about, well, maybe this is a good opportunity to think about making these environments even more developmentally enhancing than we've thought about them in the past. That's how I see some of the difference there. And it stays with us to this day.
So one of your critiques of what you describe as campaign journalism, which I understand to mean messaging that invokes the science, but is not actually driven by science, is that instead what it's actually driven by is political priorities, a particular set of political priorities, and by values. And one of the things I found so interesting in your discussion of this is your observation that values are not the same as science. You wrote, empirical evidence assumes a crucial role in establishing scientific conclusions, but not in establishing values. And that the complexity of values and of associated policy questions go way beyond what the quote science can tell us. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, because I think it's sometimes overlooked how values go incognito in our advocacy efforts on behalf of children, where we're urging policymakers and others to follow the science. And when we say that follow the science means a certain set of policy propositions, we are now incorporating values into the science we're asking them to follow. Now, that's a lot easier to see from the vantage point of 2023 than it was at the time that the public policies unfolding from the brain development agenda were beginning to be developed. Because in those days, the polarization relating to children's issues had much more to do with should parents stay home, or as the issue was framed, should mothers stay home to take care of their children, rather than working and therefore requiring some kind of childcare services. Today, we live in a world where the environment is less polarized because of the recognition that families need support of various kinds for which public policies can make a real difference. And so from the point of view of 2023, it's easier to say that, if we are concerned with parents being enabled to do the things that support their children's healthy development, then we can do so perhaps by, on one hand, supporting the availability of high quality childcare, where in addition to the home, children will be getting these inputs in a well-designed childcare program, or we can do so in terms of financial or funding supports to enable parents to make different kinds of decisions that may involve a parent staying home to take care of their children. Neither of those options is mandated by what the science of brain development says. Each of them is consistent with the science, but it was harder, I think, in those days when the arguments were more polarized concerning early childhood development to move in those directions. When I was involved with a National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, I write about in the book, we created a legislative consulting group that is representatives from state legislators from legislatures from around the country to test out some of our messaging and some of the public policy implications we were drawing from the brain development research. And I'll never forget how angrily some of them responded when we argued that we were trying to present a nonpartisan scientific message. And they said, this is not nonpartisan. All of your recommendations are part of the progressive agenda. And from the point of view of how they were seeing the ways in which families should be supported to help their children grow successfully, it was easy to understand why they felt that way. And it was only because I and others had been steeped in the more progressive set of solutions coming from the developmental research that we were a little bit blinder to how these might be seen differently, or how a different set of solutions might seem more important from a different kind of an orientation.
Yes. So looking forward, there were two kind of bottom lines that I took from your book. The first one is along the lines of what you just said, that what we need to be doing a better job at is, as you put it, establishing common ground around basic conclusions from the science and respecting alternative policy directions to which those could lead. So, in other words, ensuring that the science allows space for conservative, say, as well as progressive policy preferences. Is that what you're saying?
I think it is. And this is another reason why I say this is an easier argument to make in 2023 than it might have been a couple of decades ago, because there are people who are willing from both parts of the political divide to play in the same sandbox. And if at this point we haven't reached a point that common solutions have been identified, I think we are in a public policy environment now when there is shared concern about what some of the problems are. And when I read my conservative commentators talking about the diminishing birth rate and the disincentives that parents experience to having more than one child, and how hard it is to bring a child into the world. And I speak as one who has twice become a grandfather since the beginning of this year, and I'm watching firsthand the kinds of challenges they're facing. Then the idea that there should be much more that we as a compassionate culture can do to help ease those burdens and not require young parents situated as they are to assume them by themselves. I think we can find common ground on that problem definition and probably be able to find at least a menu of solutions, if not center on a single solution, uber alles. And so I think it is a more promising environment for doing that. And of course, there's a more promising environment as well, because we are also in common ground as it relates to a vocabulary of understanding the early years and some of the important influences that we want to support.
Yes. So finally, you made a clear point in this book that I was so impressed to see, questioning a widespread advocacy or political narrative that emphasizes young children as future avenues of economic productivity. And you asked, is it right to think of our investments in young children in transactional terms? We invest in people because that is what we owe them as fellow human beings, the social contract of the human community. People of any age and station in life deserve support, and this is especially true of children who are reliant on the care and solicitude of adults, particularly parents, but also communities who are motivated out of love and devotion to their well-being as an end in itself, not their potential to contribute to future economic prosperity. Can you say something more about that idea?
It's fun to hear you read those words back to me, Catherine. Well, that argument came at the end of a section of the book in which I talk about a pivot in the brain development revolution that arose as economists, most notably James Heckman, but also Art Rolick, whom you've interviewed on this program, and Rob Grunwald and others, as they began casting the importance of the early years within economic terms. And the argument here was that by investing in children's brain development, primarily through early education, we would be developing children who were more likely to complete school, were more likely to develop job-related skills, and therefore become productive wage earners and consumers, which would then contribute to not only the well-being of those individuals, but also to the benefit of their communities. In a sense, early childhood investment is a good economic investment strategy. And so now child advocates, because of these economists, have a new set of arguments to marshal in favor of devoting resources to early childhood development. Namely, it's not only that it'll benefit children, but that it will also benefit communities, and in so doing, more than pay for themselves. And that was part of the argument, they'll more than pay for themselves. You'll not only recoup the cost of the programs, you'll actually get economic benefits for the individual, but also for the community. And I am critical of that argument for several reasons. One is that I think that the evidence is not nearly as convincing as it appeared to be early on when we were looking primarily, or if not exclusively, at programs like Perry Preschool, and then had to discover through subsequent research that very few programs were able to match the kind of return on investment that the Perry model demonstration program were capable of achieving. But also the more broader issue of, is it wise for us to look at our investments in children in transactional terms? And this is where we come to the argument that you read. I make a case that one of the reasons that these arguments were so attractive was not only that they provided another avenue for arguing about the importance of investing resources in children, but also because they were very consistent with the neoliberalism of those days and the focus on economically competitive individuals. And so seeing brain development as part of the way in which we develop those economically competitive individuals to run the society, to invest in economic productivity for communities as well as businesses, was very consistent with a neoliberal view, but is not an appropriate way for us to think about children's development, in which children are not given a choice about coming into the world. They are dependent upon us for their care and nurturance. And our obligation to them, our reciprocal obligation to them, is to care for them, independently of what return on that investment might provide for us, independently even of the degree to which we can expect developmental gains as a result of our nurturance, but simply because they are our children and we have a moral obligation to them. And that's really the tone on which I end the whole book, which is that as much as we have helped to fulfill the beliefs of the turn of the century progressives, that child advocacy and child policy should have a strong empirical base, there was also in those progressives a strong moral cast to our responsibility to children. And I argue we shouldn't lose that. We do owe them our adult obligation to children's well-being, independent of the benefits that might derive from this, is stronger than ever.
Thank you so much for joining me today. And I want to encourage our audience again to get your absolutely fascinating book. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss it with us today.
My pleasure, Catherine. This has been fun.
Thanks so much to Professor Thompson for a fascinating conversation. And thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us today. Please subscribe to the podcast so you're always up to date. Check out CCFP's work at ccfp.org and follow us on Twitter @_CCFP and @KBStevens. We'll see you on the next episode of Early Matters.
You've been listening to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, produced by the Center on Child and Family Policy.